Isaiah Carr, a respected judge, meticulously brushed an imaginary speck of dust from the dashboard of his brand new Lexus. Barely a week old, he already treated it like a prized possession. The leather seats still held the faint scent of the factory, and the smooth purr of the engine provided a feeling of satisfaction, almost tangible. He'd just left his office at the courthouse, a long day filled with back-to-back hearings, paperwork piled high, and the weight of other people's problems. But this drive through the tree-lined streets of Winterdale, Michigan was his favorite part of the day. It allowed him to decompress, to feel in control again. The quiet streets, with their grand, sprawling homes set back from the road, offered a stark contrast to the tension that often followed him from work. But the momentary peace didn't last long. As Isaiah began to hum along to the smooth rhythm of the jazz on the radio, flashing blue and red lights tore through the evening calm. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a police cruiser tailing him. His heart skipped a beat, and his fingers instinctively tightened around the steering wheel. He pulled over without hesitation, confused but compliant. The neighborhood was quiet, far removed from the chaos of city life, and Isaiah hadn't been speeding. He knew that much. In fact, he'd been driving under the limit, enjoying the leisurely drive home after a long week. So what could he have possibly done wrong? A sharp rap on the window shattered his thoughts. He turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered officer looking down at him, her face unreadable, her hand resting close to the gun holstered at her side. "License and registration," she barked, without so much as a greeting. Isaiah silently complied, reaching into the glove compartment for his documents. The officer, her nameplate reading Officer Rhodes, snatched the papers from his hands, not even glancing at him. She scanned the papers, her eyes narrowing as she darted back and forth between the documents and Isaiah. "Step out of the car," she ordered. Isaiah blinked. "Excuse me." "Out now," she repeated, her voice harder this time, leaving no room for argument. Isaiah hesitated for a moment, his mind racing, trying to understand what was happening. He was a judge, a respected one. In fact, he had presided over cases that likely involved Officer Rhodes's own department. He was in Winterdale, where he knew people, where he was known. But here, he was being treated like a suspect. "Ma'am, there must be some misunderstanding. I'm Judge Isaiah Carr. This is my car, and I live just down the street," he explained, trying to keep his tone measured. Officer Rhodes raised an eyebrow, her hand shifting ever so slightly toward her gun. "Out now." Swallowing the rising wave of indignation, Isaiah complied. He wasn't going to make things worse. Not here. Not now. He opened the door and stepped out, standing beside his car as Officer Rhodes eyed him with a look that sent a chill down his spine. She walked around him slowly, as if sizing him up. "I received reports of a vehicle like this stolen last week," she said, her eyes fixed on him as though he'd confessed to the crime. Isaiah's jaw tightened. "This is my car. I purchased it from the dealership a few days ago. If you run the plates, it will come back clean." She didn't seem to hear, or perhaps she didn't care. "Hands on the hood," she snapped, stepping toward him. "This is unnecessary." Isaiah protested, his patience fraying at the edges. "I've done nothing wrong." Officer Rhodes's eyes glinted with something he couldn't quite place. Suspicion, or something more sinister. "You're going to do as I say, or we'll have a problem," she said, her voice hard and unyielding. Isaiah's blood ran hot, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He wasn't just anyone. He knew how to handle situations like this. He knew his rights, and he knew the law. But despite everything he'd worked for, despite everything he'd achieved, it felt as though none of that mattered at this moment. Taking a deep breath, Isaiah complied, placing his hands on the hood of the car. He could feel the eyes of the nearby residents on him, curtains twitching as neighbors peeked out, watching the spectacle unfold before them. The humiliation stung more than anything else. He'd worked his entire life to rise above moments like these, to prove himself, to be respected. But here he was, being reduced to a common suspect in front of the people he lived among. Officer Rhodes began patting him down roughly, her movements brusque and lacking any respect. "We've had reports of car thieves in the area. This vehicle matches the description of one stolen last week," she said. Isaiah clenched his jaw. "I already told you this car was purchased a few days ago. If you'll allow me to explain—" "Save it for the station," she interrupted, reaching for her handcuffs. Isaiah's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to speak calmly, clearly. Officer Rhodes, I suggest you call your superior before you make a decision you'll regret. Her hand hovered above the cuffs. You expect me to believe that? Isaiah looked her in the eye, unwavering. I expect you to verify my identity and do your job properly. Something shifted in her expression, just a flicker of uncertainty. Her confidence wavered, and she stepped back. With a frustrated huff, she reached for her radio and muttered into it, keeping her gaze locked on Isaiah. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Isaiah stood there, hands still on the car, while Officer Rhodes glanced between him and her radio, waiting for confirmation. The air crackled with tension, and Isaiah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Neighbors still peeked from behind their curtains, witnessing his humiliation. Finally, the radio crackled to life, and a voice came through. Rhodes, stand down immediately. Judge Carr is a respected member of the community. I'm on my way. Isaiah straightened, feeling a surge of relief, but the damage had already been done. His dignity had been tarnished, and no amount of apologies could erase the humiliation he'd endured. Officer Rhodes's face flushed with embarrassment as she lowered her radio. She hesitated for a moment, then muttered, I'm sorry, Your Honor. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. Isaiah adjusted his jacket, his composure regained, though the anger still simmered beneath the surface. A misunderstanding, he echoed, his voice calm but firm. Is that what we're calling racial profiling now, officer? Before she could respond, another police car pulled up, and a tall man with graying hair stepped out. Captain Reynolds, head of the local precinct, approached with an air of urgency. Judge Carr, he called out as he approached, his expression grave. I can't begin to apologize enough for this incident. Rest assured, we'll get to the bottom of it. Isaiah nodded, but his mind was already racing with the implications of what had just happened. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the countless others who had been wrongly accused, harassed, or profiled. And now, as he stood there with Captain Reynolds offering his apologies, Isaiah made a decision that would change the course of his life and the lives of many others. Captain, Isaiah said, his voice steady and authoritative, I'd like to speak with you and Officer Rhodes, not as a victim, but as someone who believes we can turn this incident into an opportunity for real change. Captain Reynolds looked taken aback by the request, but there was respect in his eyes. Of course, Your Honor. Whatever you need. Isaiah nodded and glanced around at the neighborhood. The quiet street. The houses with their curtains still drawn. He had worked too hard to be reduced to this, to be seen as nothing more than a suspect, as a threat. But he also knew that moments like this could become something more. They could be the catalyst for growth, for understanding, for change. As they walked toward Captain Reynolds's car, Isaiah couldn't help but wonder if this moment, this public humiliation, could be the start of something bigger. Could this be the spark that ignited real conversations about the system, about justice, about what it meant to be truly seen for who you were, not the color of your skin? He little knew this was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, prejudice, and the power of one person to make a difference. Isaiah stood in his home later that evening, the familiar comfort of the space offering little relief from the weight pressing down on him. The encounter with Officer Rhodes replayed in his mind, every detail sharp, every word echoing like a warning. He knew this wasn't a singular event. It wasn't about one mistake or one person. It was the result of something bigger, a system he thought he understood but now realized he was deeply entangled in, for better or worse. His wife Denise entered the room, sensing the tension in his posture, even before he spoke. Isaiah, what's wrong? She asked, placing a hand on his shoulder. She knew him well enough to see the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. He sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as if that could ease the frustration that had been building since the traffic stop. You won't believe what happened today. I was pulled over, accused of stealing my own car. Denise's eyes widened in disbelief. You? Here in Winterdale? He nodded. Yeah, by one of our own officers. Rhodes. She had me get out of the car, hands on the hood, the whole humiliating drill. The neighbors watched, curtains moving, but nobody came out, not a word, not a soul. Denise's expression shifted from concern to anger. Isaiah, this is unacceptable. You're a judge. They know you. And that's exactly the problem, Isaiah replied, his voice low but fierce. It doesn't matter who I am or what I've achieved. In their eyes, I was just another black man driving a nice car in the wrong neighborhood. If it can happen to me, what does that say for the others who don't have the same resources, the same protection? Denise shook her head, her frustration mirroring his. This is ridiculous. Something has to change. Isaiah walked to the window, staring out at the perfectly manicured lawns and neatly parked cars. I talked to the captain afterward, suggested a program, something to teach these officers about what it's like for us on the other side of the badge. But it's not enough. Denise moved closer, her voice softening. What are you going to do? Isaiah turned toward her, his jaw set with determination. I'm going to use this. I can't let this moment slip by. We've been complacent for too long. I want to sit down with Officer Rhodes, with the entire precinct, and show them what real justice looks like. Not just for me, but for everyone. Denise smiled faintly, her eyes filled with both pride and worry. I know you will, but be careful, Isaiah. These things, they don't change overnight. You'll be pushing against a lot of resistance. Isaiah nodded, knowing full well the truth in her words. That's why it has to start now. The following week, Isaiah found himself standing before a group of police officers in a conference room at the Winterdale Police Department. The air in the room was thick with tension, as if the weight of past mistakes and unspoken accusations hovered just above their heads. Officer Rhodes sat among them, her face tight, her eyes flickering between discomfort and defiance. Isaiah could sense the battle going on inside her, whether to admit she had been wrong or to double down on the assumptions she had made. Captain Reynolds stood near the back, arms crossed, watching intently. Isaiah cleared his throat and began. I'm not here to lecture anyone, he said, his voice calm but firm. I'm here because I believe something needs to change. Last week I was pulled over by one of your officers. It wasn't because I was speeding. It wasn't because I was breaking the law. It was because I was driving a nice car in a neighborhood where I apparently didn't look like I belonged. The room remained silent, but Isaiah could feel the discomfort growing. A few officers shifted in their seats, one or two glancing at Rhodes, who stared straight ahead, her face a mask of indifference. I've spent my entire career working to uphold the law, Isaiah continued. I've sat in courtrooms day after day, watching people's lives change with a single decision. I've worked hard to ensure that justice is served fairly and impartially, but last week I was reminded that no matter how far you climb, no matter what title you hold, there are still some battles that you can't avoid. His gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of each officer one by one. This isn't about me, it's about the system, it's about the way we see each other. It's about the assumptions we make when we look at someone like me behind the wheel of a nice car. Isaiah could see a few heads nodding subtly, but most of the room remained stoic, the walls of defense firmly in place. We can't change everything overnight, he said, echoing Denise's words. But we can start small. We can start by having conversations like this, by challenging those assumptions, by understanding that every time you make a decision based on bias, you're not just hurting one person, you're hurting the community, the justice system, and the trust that's supposed to exist between us. Officer Rhodes finally spoke, voice stiff. I was just doing my job, sir. We had reports of a stolen car, and yours matched the description. Isaiah nodded, his expression calm. I understand that, officer, but when I told you who I was, when I offered to show you proof, you didn't listen. You assumed I was lying. That's the problem. It's not about following orders. It's about recognizing when those orders are flawed. The room fell silent again, the weight of his words sinking in. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his voice quieter than before. We've all seen it, Judge Carr. We know the biases are there, but the question is, what do we do about them? Isaiah met his gaze. We start by acknowledging that they exist, and then we work together to dismantle them. There was a murmur of agreement in the room, and for the first time, Isaiah felt like maybe, just maybe, they were starting to understand. It was a small step, but it was something. Weeks passed, and the tension from that meeting slowly began to fade. Officer Rhodes had agreed to shadow Isaiah in his courtroom, an offer he had extended to help bridge the gap between the badge and the bench. It wasn't easy at first. Her rigid demeanor and cool detachment were hard to break through, but Isaiah was patient. One afternoon, after watching him preside over a particularly difficult case involving a young black man falsely accused of assault, Rhodes finally broke her silence. I never realized how much of this is out of their control, she admitted quietly, standing beside Isaiah after the courtroom had emptied. Isaiah glanced at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her tone. What do you mean? Rhodes sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. I mean, you hear things in the station, you see people brought in, and you start to make assumptions. We're trained to follow protocols, but we're not trained to understand what happens after. I've been sitting here, watching you, watching these people's lives get torn apart by a system that's supposed to protect them. It's different when you see it up close. Isaiah nodded, his voice gentle. It's different when you live it. Rhodes looked down, her jaw clenched. I'm sorry for what happened that day. I really am. Isaiah didn't respond right away. He could sense the internal struggle she was going through, the process of unlearning that was far more painful than anyone cared to admit. Apologies are a good start, he finally said. But what really matters is what you do next. Rhodes nodded slowly. I know. And I want to do better. I want to understand. Isaiah smiled, a small flicker of hope sparking inside him. That's all I can ask for. A month later, Winterdale found itself the subject of national headlines. A local contractor, Apex Builders, had been exposed for running unsafe construction sites and bribing city officials to overlook violations. The story was big enough on its own, but what made it even more explosive was the involvement of high-ranking officers within the Winterdale Police Department, some of whom had been complicit in covering up the company's wrongdoings. Isaiah had heard whispers of the scandal before it broke wide open. He'd been presiding over a few cases related to the construction company and had started piecing things together, but the full extent of the corruption didn't hit him until one late evening when his phone buzzed with a message from Aaron, a detective he'd known for years. We need to talk. Urgent. Isaiah met Aaron at a quiet diner on the edge of town. It was nearly deserted, just a few late-night patrons hunched over cups of coffee. Aaron slid into the booth across from Isaiah, his face etched with worry. What's going on? Isaiah asked, his voice low. Aaron glanced around, then leaned in. Apex Builders. They're in deep with some people at the top of the department. Bribes, falsified reports. You name it. And it's bigger than we thought. Isaiah frowned. How big are we talking? Aaron hesitated, then spoke in a whisper. I think the chief's involved, maybe even the mayor. Isaiah felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a simple case of a few bad actors. This was systemic, and it reached further than he'd ever imagined. Aaron continued, his voice tense. They've been trying to silence people. Some of the officers who were involved have been burying complaints, and now that the story's breaking, they're scrambling to cover their tracks. Isaiah leaned back in his seat, the weight of the situation settling in. Why are you telling me this? Because you're the only one I trust, Aaron said, his gaze steady. And because I need your help. You're in a position to do something about this, to make sure the truth comes out. Isaiah nodded slowly, his mind already racing with the implications of what Aaron was saying. If the corruption went as high as Aaron suspected, then this wasn't just a local issue. It was a threat to the entire community's trust in its leadership. All right, Isaiah said finally, I'll help, but we need to be careful. If they're willing to cover up this much, they won't hesitate to go after anyone who gets in their way. Aaron nodded grimly. I know. That's why we have to move fast. Isaiah spent the next few days quietly gathering evidence, reviewing court records and complaints that had been dismissed without cause. The deeper he dug, the more he realized just how entangled the police department was with Apex Builders. Payments off the record, meetings and falsified reports pointed to a web of corruption that threatened to ensnare anyone who got too close. And it wasn't just about money, it was about power, control, and the unchecked authority that allowed those in charge to act without consequence. Late one night, as Isaiah pored over documents in his home office, his phone buzzed again. Another message from Aaron. They know, be careful. Isaiah's pulse quickened. He had known this was a possibility, that the more he uncovered, the more dangerous things would become, but seeing those words in front of him made it all the more real. Isaiah stared at the message from Aaron, the words burning into his mind. They know, be careful. He leaned back in his chair, the silence of the house pressing in around him. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the large oak tree in his front yard, its leaves rustling softly, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in his life. He had to be smart about this. It wasn't just his reputation on the line anymore. It was his life. The more he uncovered about Apex Builders and the police department, the more dangerous things became. Aaron had made it clear that they were running out of time, and now that those in power knew what he was digging into, Isaiah had no doubt they would try to silence him before he got too close. He glanced at the clock. It was nearing midnight, and the house was quiet save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. Denise had already gone to bed, but Isaiah was too wired to sleep. His mind raced with the implications of what he'd discovered and the possible consequences that were coming his way. He needed more evidence, something concrete that would blow this whole thing wide open, but he couldn't do it alone. He needed people he could trust, people who would stand by him when things got messy, and he knew exactly who to call. The next morning, Isaiah met with Aaron again, this time in a small park on the outskirts of town. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the grass, and the air was crisp with the promise of fall. Aaron was already there when Isaiah arrived, pacing by a bench, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Thanks for coming," Aaron said, shaking Isaiah's hand as he sat down. "I don't have much time, but we need to talk strategy." Isaiah nodded, scanning the park for any signs of unwelcome visitors. "How bad is it?" "Worse than I thought," Aaron admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I've been keeping my head down, but I've heard enough to know that they're onto us. They've been watching me too." "We don't have much time." Isaiah leaned forward, lowering his voice. "We need to get our hands on the internal police records, everything related to Apex Builders and any communications between the officers involved. That's the only way we can expose them." Aaron nodded. "I've been working on that. There's a chance I can get into the department's database, but it's risky. If anyone catches wind of what I'm doing, it's over for both of us." Isaiah sighed, rubbing his temples. He knew the stakes, but he couldn't turn back now. Too many people's lives had already been damaged by this corruption. He had to see it through, no matter the cost. "Let's be smart about this," Isaiah said. "We'll keep our circle small, you, me, and maybe one or two people we can trust. We'll need all the evidence we can get. And once we have it, we'll go public, with the media, with the Attorney General's office, someone outside this town who can't be bought." Aaron nodded again, his eyes hard with determination. "I'll get started on it tonight, but we need to be ready for anything, Isaiah. If they find out we're going public, they'll come after us with everything they've got." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "I know, but they won't scare us off." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Winterdale, Isaiah sat down with Denise, explaining everything in full detail. She listened intently, her face growing more serious with each passing moment. When he finished, Denise shook her head in disbelief. "Isaiah, it's dangerous. These people are powerful. What if they try to hurt you?" "I can't back down now, Denise," Isaiah replied, his voice steady. "If I don't do this, who will? I've seen what these people are capable of. They're ruining lives, and no one is holding them accountable." Denise took a deep breath, her eyes filled with both pride and fear. "Just promise me you'll be careful. You have a family, Isaiah. We need you." Isaiah reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I promise." Meanwhile, Aaron had taken to staying in a motel on the outskirts of town, keeping a low profile while they waited for the dust to settle. He knew they had stirred up a hornet's nest, and it was only a matter of time before things escalated. One night, as Aaron sat in his dingy motel room, his phone buzzed with a call. He answered it, expecting another threat, but instead, it was Lisa Chen from the news station. "Aaron, I just got word from one of my sources," Lisa said, her voice tense. "There's a warrant out for your arrest." Aaron froze. "What? What are they accusing you of?" "Tampering with evidence in a previous case," she explained. "It's a setup, Aaron. They're coming for you." Aaron's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this was coming, but it still hit him like a punch to the gut. They were trying to discredit him, to silence him before he could do any more damage. "Thanks for the heads up, Lisa," Aaron said, his voice tight. "I'll figure something out." He hung up the phone, his mind racing. They were closing in on him, and if he didn't act fast, it would be too late. He couldn't let them win, not now, not after everything they had uncovered. Aaron quickly packed his things and slipped out of the motel room, his eyes scanning the parking lot for any sign of danger. He had to move fast, but he couldn't stay in hiding forever. He needed to find a way to fight back. The next morning, Isaiah received a call from Aaron. His friend's voice was strained. The weight of the situation was clearly taking its toll. "They're after me," Aaron said. "I've got a warrant out for my arrest." Isaiah's heart sank. "For what?" "Tampering with evidence. It's all fabricated, Isaiah. They're trying to take me down." Isaiah gritted his teeth, his mind racing. "Where are you?" "On the move?" Aaron replied. "I can't stay in one place too long, but we need to do something. They're trying to make us disappear, to make this all go away." Isaiah nodded, already formulating a plan. "We'll fight this, Aaron. But we need more than just what we've got. We need someone higher up, someone who can blow this wide open." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Aaron spoke again, his voice low. "There's one more thing, Isaiah. Something I didn't tell you." Isaiah's brow furrowed. "What is it?" "I got a tip from someone inside," Aaron said. "There's more going on here than just corruption. Apex Builders, they've been involved in something bigger, and it's connected to the police department. It's not just about covering up violations, it's about controlling the town." Isaiah felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about?" "There's a network, Isaiah. A web of people who've been running this town from the shadows for years. Apex Builders is just the front. The real power lies with the people pulling the strings, and they'll do anything to keep it that way." Isaiah's grip on the phone tightened. "Who's behind it?" "I don't know yet," Aaron admitted. "But I'm going to find out. I just need time." Isaiah's mind raced. This was bigger than he'd ever imagined. It wasn't just about corrupt officers or a shady construction company. It was about something far more dangerous, something that could destroy everything they had worked for. "Be careful, Aaron," Isaiah said, his voice heavy with concern. "We're in deep now." "I know," Aaron replied, "but we're not backing down." Isaiah hung up the phone, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What Aaron had just told him changed everything. If Apex Builders was just a front for something bigger, then the corruption went far deeper than even they had suspected. And now Aaron was in hiding with a fabricated arrest warrant hanging over his head. Isaiah stood in the center of his living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Denise entered quietly, sensing the storm brewing inside him. "What is it?" she asked gently, concern etched across her face. Isaiah sighed, running a hand over his face. "It's worse than we thought, Denise." Aaron uncovered more. "Apex Builders is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole network of people running this town, and they're pulling the strings from the shadows." Denise's eyes widened, her hand covering her mouth. "Isaiah, what are you going to do?" He met her gaze, his jaw set with determination. "I don't know yet, but I can't back down, not now." Denise stepped closer, taking his hands in hers. "You're not alone in this. Just be careful, please." Isaiah nodded, his heart heavy with both fear and resolve. He pulled her into a tight embrace, drawing strength from her warmth, from the love they shared. He knew this battle was far from over, but he also knew that he couldn't stop fighting, not until justice was served. The next morning, Isaiah sat in his office, staring at the documents spread out before him. They had enough evidence to expose the corruption in Winterdale, but now that Aaron had uncovered the deeper conspiracy, everything felt much more dangerous. If there were powerful figures behind Apex Builders, they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. Isaiah picked up the phone and dialed the number of an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years but knew could help. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Isaiah Carr, long time no see." "Joseph, I need your help," Isaiah said, cutting straight to the point. Joseph was an attorney who had worked in the state's Attorney General's office. They had crossed paths several times over the years, but this was different. Isaiah was calling in a favor. Joseph's tone shifted. "What's going on?" "I've uncovered something big. Corruption in the police department, bribes, falsified reports. It's all connected to a local construction company, but it goes deeper. I need someone who can take this to the highest level, someone I can trust." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Joseph spoke again, his voice low. "You're serious about this?" "I wouldn't be calling you if I wasn't." "All right," Joseph said. "Send me what you have. I'll take a look and see what we can do. But Isaiah, be careful, you're playing with fire." Isaiah nodded, knowing full well the risks. "I know, but this needs to be done." Days passed and the tension in Winterdale only grew. The protests outside the police station and City Hall intensified, with more and more people demanding answers. The broadcast had sparked a firestorm, and there was no putting it out. But the threats against Isaiah and Aaron also escalated. Anonymous phone calls, strange cars parked outside their homes, everything felt like a ticking time bomb. And now that Aaron was in hiding, Isaiah felt the weight of the fight on his shoulders. He spent every waking moment reviewing the evidence, working with Joseph to build a case that would expose the full extent of the corruption. But the more he dug, the more dangerous things became. One evening, as Isaiah was leaving the courthouse, a black SUV pulled up beside him. The tinted window rolled down, revealing a man in a suit with a cold, calculating gaze. "Judge Carr," the man said, his voice smooth. "A word of advice, walk away while you still can." Isaiah's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. "I'm not walking away." The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "That's unfortunate. You're making this personal." Isaiah clenched his fists. "This is about justice, and I'm not afraid of you." The man's smile faded and his gaze hardened. "You should be." Without another word, the window rolled up and the SUV sped off, leaving Isaiah standing alone on the street, his pulse racing. Isaiah knew he couldn't wait any longer. The people behind Apex Builders weren't going to let this go quietly, and now that they had made their threats personal, he needed to act fast. That night, he met with Joseph and Lisa Chen, the news producer who had helped them air the original broadcast. They gathered in a small conference room, poring over the documents and planning their next move. "We have everything we need," Joseph said, his voice steady. "The evidence is airtight. We'll take this to the state's Attorney General's office tomorrow morning. Once this goes public, there's no going back." Isaiah nodded, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "Let's do it." But just as they were about to leave the room, Isaiah's phone buzzed. It was a message from Aaron. "I've got the final piece. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th Street. Isaiah's stomach twisted. The warehouse on 5th Street was a rundown, abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It was the last place anyone would want to meet, especially in the middle of the night. He showed the message to Joseph and Lisa, his voice tense. "Aaron wants to meet. He says he has the final piece." Joseph frowned. It could be a trap. Isaiah shook his head. "No, it's Aaron. I trust him." Lisa nodded, though her expression was tight with concern. "Then let's go, but we need to be careful." Isaiah, Joseph and Lisa arrived at the warehouse just before midnight. The building was dark and looming, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. The wind howled through the empty streets, adding to the sense of unease that hung in the air. They parked the car a few blocks away and approached the warehouse on foot, their footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. Isaiah's heart raced as they stepped inside, the darkness swallowing them whole. He scanned the empty space, searching for any sign of Aaron. "Aaron?" he called out, his voice bouncing off the walls. For a moment, there was only silence. But then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Aaron, his face pale and strained. He clutched a folder in his hand, his eyes darting around nervously. "I've got it," Aaron said, his voice shaky. "The final piece. The connection between Apex Builders and the police department. It's all here." Isaiah felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Let's see it." But before Aaron could hand over the folder, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Isaiah's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the entrance, his pulse quickening. From the shadows, a group of men appeared. Dark suits, cold expressions. The same men who had threatened Isaiah outside the courthouse. "You should have listened, Judge Carr," one of the men said, his voice low and menacing. Isaiah stepped in front of Aaron, shielding him from the men. "You're too late. The truth is already out." The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see about that." Before Isaiah could react, one of the men lunged toward Aaron, grabbing the folder from his hands. Aaron struggled, but the men were too strong. They tore the folder from his grasp, scattering the papers across the floor. Isaiah's blood boiled as he rushed forward, but one of the men shoved him back, sending him crashing into a wall. "Enough," the man growled. "You've caused enough trouble." But just as they were about to make their escape, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Flashing blue and red lights flooded the warehouse, and the men froze. "Drop it!" a voice shouted. It was Lisa, standing in the doorway, a police officer by her side. The men hesitated for a moment, but then, one by one, they dropped the folder and raised their hands. Isaiah's heart raced as the police moved in, handcuffing the men and escorting them out of the warehouse. He rushed to Aaron's side, helping him to his feet. "You okay?" Isaiah asked, his voice breathless. Aaron nodded, though his face was pale. "Yeah, thanks." Isaiah glanced at the scattered papers on the floor, relief flooding through him. "We did it." The fallout from the arrests was swift and brutal. The evidence they had uncovered was enough to bring down not just Apex builders, but several high-ranking officials in the Winterdale Police Department and local government. The town was rocked by the scandal, and for the first time in years, people began to see just how deep the corruption had gone. Isaiah and Aaron were hailed as heroes, though neither of them felt particularly heroic. They had done what needed to be done, but the cost had been high. They had put everything on the line, and though justice had been served, the scars would remain. But there was a sense of hope now, hope that things would change, that the town could rebuild, that the system could be reformed. A few weeks later, Isaiah stood on the steps of the courthouse, looking out over the town he had fought so hard to protect. The air was crisp, and the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the streets. Denise joined him, slipping her hand into his. "How do you feel?" Isaiah took a deep breath, his heart full. "Like we're just getting started." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them, but there was also a sense of peace now, a sense of purpose. Isaiah had always believed in the law, in the power of justice, and though the fight had been long and hard, he knew that it had been worth it, because in the end, justice had prevailed, and that was all that mattered.